So good afternoon and welcome. It's really great to be here with all of you. And my name is Mostafavi from the GSD, and I think it's wonderful that this exhibition is happening and that we get to see the work of so many interesting people. Really thank you to the Biennial, the sponsors, to Mayor BilbaoEmanuel for initiating this project. And of course, thanks to Mark and Sharon for really doing such a wonderful job with the exhibition. I think it's probably quite well known that Mark and Sharon have been very much involved with the GSD, especially for the last few years, as have a number of the people who are here involved with the panel discussion and indeed in the exhibition. And so there is, in a sense, a certain idea of affiliations, of friendships, of people who are also working together, which I think is very much part and parcel of what is at stake in terms of the discussion. I'm also, by way of a happy news and fortuitous news, I'm really delighted that both Mark and Sharon will be now more formally joining the GSD as professors of practice starting very soon. So this is also a great news for us and hopefully for them. This symposium in some ways is a continuation of the conversations this morning, but probably what we hope to do, what we attempt to do, is to create more of a sort of configuration or bring some of the conversation closer, because I think what we heard this morning were many, many positions. And at the risk of seeming to be too reductive, I think it nevertheless is important that we try to see or explore what are the consequences of such a project for us, for the future, for contemporary practice. The title, New Materialisms, Histories Make Practice, Practices Make History, which actually in terms of the organization of the panels is reversed, because we're starting with this panel, which is essentially Practices Make History, and the second panel will be the panel Histories Make Practice, is in some ways a kind of false dichotomy. It's a false dualism. Essentially, the panels are quite similar in terms of the people who are on them, but there is an emphasis in terms of the way in which the first focuses more on the relationship of practice to the construction of history, to the making of history, and the second one, practices that are really, in some sense, there is a greater emphasis on the way in which they rely or refer to history as part of as a constitutive part of their practice. And I think it also builds on in a way, the agenda or the mandate of the biennial, which in a sense, by asking us to make new history, it's really a call to action in terms of a proactive work of the practitioner, and also the questioning of a new set of relationships or connections with history. And I think this is precisely our way of respecting and referring to the issues. These conversations also have been very much part and parcel of a set of discussions between Michael Hayes, Ken Stewart from the GSD, and myself over the last few weeks and months. And Michael actually has been very, very specific in terms of, in a way, specifying somehow the nuance of difference between the two panels and their interrelationships. The first panel, which includes Sharon, Antoine, PiconTatiana, BarkowFrancis, BilbaoEmanuel, Christ, and Francis Kéré, are charged with this idea of considering practices, which these are, that on the one hand deal with strict practical limits of economy, site, program, and the material support for social activity and habitation, but whose designers, on the other hand, often place attention on education, writing, research, and representation as much as issues of building and habitation, which is to say they seem as concerned with architecture as a discipline as they are with building as a support for social programs. Conventional critiques that rely on binary oppositions like aesthetics versus social function, or form versus context cannot adequately explain how these practices produce works of architecture whose influence and affinities exceed their locales, whose experiences resonate across different contexts, thereby making history as much as deriving from history. We ask each of the architects in this panel to be prepared with a short 5-minute statement of how their practice relates to architecture's history and how their work might produce greater attention and attachment to realities of social context and history. And of course, each of these panels will include a moderator, curator, historian, and critic. The second panel, Histories Make Practice, brings together practices which seem to refuse issues of meaning in a semiotic, referential, or figurative sense, but nevertheless produce progressive works of architecture with a correlated respect for past architectures and the history of the discipline of architecture. I'll let Michael expand on that in his own terms. That panel includes Mark Lee, Sarah Whiting, Anton García-Abril, Anna Neimark, and Sophia von Ellrichshausen. So they will come second. We probably want to, of course, also emphasize that we would like these two panels to be as quickly as possible conversational. If, because of the mandate of the biennial, the first session of the symposium was more descriptive in terms of people explaining what they're doing, we're very much hoping that these two panels will be much more propositional, essentially trying to establish specific positions in relation to the dialogical relationships between topic 1 and topic 2. So without further delay, I'm going to ask Sharon also to expand on the theme of this topic 1 before we pass it on to Frank Barkow. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Mohsen. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's having some endurance from a couple hours this morning to being back in this room. So I'm, of course, an architect, but wearing my curator hat today. And I think it's perhaps an important distinction because when Mark and I thought about the proposition of being involved in the biennial, I think we really were more interested in putting forth a set of questions as more as a kind of provocation than trying to present a kind of singular vision that would be sort of fulfilled by all of the participants in the show. And so I think for us to be able to be part of this conversation, all the symposia that are happening in these opening days is really important. I mean, this is why we're doing this as much as seeing the works on view, to have these kinds of conversations. And I think just a few, maybe perhaps a few words of context about the work in the show to help perhaps frame the discussion and the presentations of the participants. I think that we believe that for Architects Today and specifically the panelists that will speak, questions of history are pressing in their practice. I think that perhaps specifically to this group of architects, questions of the specific history of buildings is a strong focus of their design research. And I think for many reasons that we'll probably hear a little bit about, but perhaps just to highlight the issues of contextual history, the context within which these particular artifacts exist, and also perhaps their typological conditions. I think what's exciting about this kind of renewed debate about history today and at the biennial is, I think for all of us, we see that history is less hierarchical. It's a more of a kind of horizon than a kind of linear trajectory. And as a result, I think we're seeing architects dipping into different moments of history as they're encountering different problems in their practice, particular paradigms of buildings and such. And that in doing so, I think that there's a provocative kind of collapsing of questions of kind of the contemporary and the historical between practice and more disciplinary, longer range sets of disciplinary questions. I think perhaps it's also worth noting that we think it's particularly relevant to be talking about these questions in an environment like this, a kind of exhibition format. We're not in an academic symposia, we're not in someone's office, but we're in a kind of middle ground. And I think that part of what that allows us to do, perhaps more easily, is to find a kind of a common project. I think that this biennial has given Mark and I a chance to talk to a lot of architects, and hopefully what you'll see in the exhibition allows us to build bridges, to find certain kind of commonalities that could be relevant for a more collective discussion. I think the way the exhibition is formatted and the way that I think we hope to talk about the work today, it's not, it's organized to invite debate, sort of look at perhaps works that might be incongruous and look for ways to generate new meaning. And I think it's also relevant because many architects today, we're working in many different sort of mediums. It's not only building buildings, we're designing exhibitions, we're designing temporary pavilions. So the sort of range of what it means to be a practicing architect today, I think, is much different. And so the chance to talk about these ideas in a biennial format, we're amongst each other's work, we're amongst friends and new acquaintances, and I think that opens us up to particularly provocative conversation. The last thing I wanted to make just a kind of brief observation about that may be part of our collective discussion afterwards is that all of the participants that will be speaking in the first section have all contributed all have contributed to a tower of some format to the exhibition. And I think that raises perhaps an issue that we might talk about, which is the kind of commonality of type as being something that bridges between one's professional practice and a sort of larger, more historic trajectory of the discipline. So in the case of ChristFrank, I think the question of precedent and the sort of precise way that you look at precedent in your practice, both as a teacher and as a practitioner, is particularly, I think, relevant and stands out in your work. I think for Francis, your histories are perhaps come from a different place than ChristFrank, but in your tower contribution, I think what's provocative is that you're sort of crossing the paradigm, the sort of structural problem of the tower with a kind of ambition of bringing a new kind of sense of the commonality or sense of community into the kind of vertical nature of the tower. I think that's something interesting to talk about. Tatiana, I think in her tower is really thinking about a new way to think about urbanization and a vertical orientation. And I think also worth noting in your practice is the idea of bringing multiple voices and hands to the way that your work is formed with collaborators. And finally, in Barkau-Leibinger's work and in Frank's project that their team has contributed, I think, as he talked about earlier, but this problem of sort of crossing a certain kind of typology of building with a material system, which invents perhaps a new way of thinking about this sort of mid-rise tower.
Frank, do you want to start? We have asked, by the way, everybody to have only 2 images, and at the end we'll have everybody's images here so that we are deliberately trying to limit the number of images that each of our speakers has. So, yeah. Please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the continuation of the discussion this morning. I just wanted to read a quick statement. We look at history as an instrument, among others, as in it might be something you can use. This is not a sentimental view of history, simply as an observation about a growing body of knowledge acquired over time. In the 3 examples we are displaying in this Biennale are 3 residential towers, prototypes which can be situated on an array of different sites for affordable housing in Berlin. Each is derived and articulated by sourcing 3 very different histories. And I also wanted to say this about history is, I think there's also a kind of nonchalance in the way we work. In these examples, history is very determinate, and other projects it might not be. So again, there's a kind of, I suppose, agility in the way we think and work. In the first example, of these three towers is the 1971 film Swamp by artists Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson. Number two is Heinrich Tesseno's 1936 Festhalle in Rügen, Germany. And the third history is the Plattenbau, which are precast concrete social housing from the Cold War era of Eastern Europe. So again, very, in a sense, eccentric and very different histories informing similar types of projects. Each of these histories act as drivers for a material and tectonic solution for the same thing: Point Tower, residential high-rises in Berlin, a city desperate for low-cost housing and can easily be inserted into the city, increasing density and new forms of dwelling. Our interest in history is not incidental or anecdotal. We are not interested in history as an inspiration, a footnote, or an analogy. Our interest is purely instrumental. What is an historical artifact's currency? Here, history is a tool, not a reference. Specific to these choices is the fact that these historical examples are materially specific: timber, precast concrete, or reed thatch plants. Often, as in the Plattenbau example, a material production capability is demonstrated as a way of making social housing. Consistent with all of these examples is the transformative aspect of how we treat these references. The interpretive aspect, which uses techniques such as copy-paste, repetition, stacking, exchange, etc. In this way, all of these histories are evolved into a contemporary, new, or Jetztzeit that are technologically, programmatically, and socially transformed. This is not a mantra, but one way of working among others that stands for the idea that architecture is a search, and that we are constantly looking for means that allow us to think of our practice, which includes, this was said earlier, research, building, and teaching as an evolving and reactionary, as reacting to new forms of knowledge and know-how, and finding ways to use them. This allows our work to be differentiated and favors curiosity and experimentation over repetition and signature. Thank you. Oh, yeah, could you pop the second image? That was great. Oh, thanks. Yeah. You're way ahead of me.
Tatiana?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me here. I like to think in terms of times and place rather than history. I learned, I think, the hard way that understanding the place, the importance of the rigid codes that the place allow us to take information for are very important. The practical things of understanding the people who are going to build it, the capabilities and possibilities of the hand labor that it's going to be the ones that are going to create physically our architecture, the economical capacities of the place, the political possibilities or contradictions of the site, the social construction of it. I think that for us, the understanding of the moment and the place where we're building, it's exactly what is giving out all the information to do our architecture. I think that the social construction has all the codes that history has imposed into them, all the cultural baggage that is there. It's what gives us this line of the possibility of intervention. And I always see the architecture that we do as an insertion in a space, a landscape, a cityscape that becomes part of it in a way. A piece becomes part of a collage. We are using the possibilities and the extension of the idea of collage, not only as of understanding how our architecture becomes part of the social tissue, the urban tissue, or the landscape, but also as a way of representation and a way of integrating different ideas, different parts, but also the codes of the place and the time. I think, indeed, history plays a role, but plays a role through its actors, through its interactors, and through the people that are there. I think for me, starting to think that instead of architecture being a pose and an impose and an imposition, needs to become part of the platform. And the social codes would be then the imposition towards architecture. In a way, doing this, and if you can go to the second image, and translating into the possibilities that this has to a space of a living space, for me is the most interesting way of research now, of understanding how we could become the construction of social stories, how can we become the possibilitators of these stories to happen instead of imposing those stories, and how we could be the platform for people to create their own living with their own possibilities instead of imposing our ideas of program and typology. And then probably we're the providers of the aesthetic vision of it, but how could be only the providers of that and then allow these possibilities to be more expandable for every person in the planet to inhabit it. And in a way, so as I said, like the collage becomes part of the representation, but also part of the possibilities of the architecture. It's a way of adding different visions, but it's a way of also putting a composition together that creates a collective vision, but also that could become the collective as a collective. And I think when architecture has started to become the individual represented in the collective to then create and being redundant about it, to then create the possibility of this collective as an identity to each individual, I think is when architecture is going to have impact in the world, because at the moment I think we have very little impact and we need to do more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tatiana. Francis, please.
It's my turn?
Yeah.
So thank you for inviting me here. Very simple, I feel very, very privileged. If I'm looking to the auditorium, people from my continent are less here represented, which shows that architecture that we know is still something that is far, far, far from the people. I simply grew up in an area, when you happen to build a wall for someone, and if this wall is straight, and let me say, able to stand a rainy season, then you become a hero, simply a hero, because you are real. Architecture has been considered as something for corporate or government, with all the connotation that we know, fear, oppression, so it was not close to the people. It's a pity that if you know all these great buildings that was modernist buildings that have been built after independence in many of the countries, they're so beautiful, but there is no relation to the people. So this is the context where I grew up. And what I'm trying to do, or what I started to do, I started to work as an architect, so as a student. I was exploring, I was researching, I was manipulating material to see what I can do. Simply, for example, you take the clay that is there, that have been used by the people for a long time, and you give it, you transform it a little bit, and you give it a sort of the missing element, the regularity, manipulating the structure, putting cement, and then we could build, and people was excited. So can you imagine what happened now that I see that I can give something, what I have been doing to keep pushing? And the few professionals in the country were saying, Francis is not an architect, he's a researcher, which is good. They did it just to keep me away from bigger project, potentially, but this is exactly what I was doing. And if you look at the picture that you see, we even take here down, the kids are sitting, leaning back to laterite walls, which we just took it. It has been used since my people exist, but people consider it primitive, and we just cut it. We cut it with the machine, and then, believe me, nowadays, everywhere in Burkina, people show these pictures, and everyone is dreaming to use laterite. It's going through the culture, and the same architect that was trying to just kick me away as just sending young people, like calling in the office, Francis, here is Mr. and Mr. I want you to take a young architect who loves your work. I love your work, so to enter. You know, it's like starting very naive, and to create something that is keep going. Like on the top picture, we added even a piece of wood that is used as a temporary, and we use it as a screen, as a brise-soleil, and people start to just copy it and apply it in their own shelter. Can I have the next picture? And so, of course, everyone wants to land back in Europe. I studied architecture in Germany, and now all the modernistic architects, I love Mies van der Rohe, so, and many other. And so having the chance, for example, to demonstrate what we have learned and what I have been accumulating during my time in Africa back allowed me with my team in Berlin to just use wood in a very, very different way to create something that is that can be seen, that is visible, that shape people's dreams, let's say like this. So to create a space where people can meet and stay, and using a wood in another very, very unexpected way, and you can see it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Manu.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I brought two pictures, and I wanted to address one aspect, perhaps, of making history or remaking history. I would perhaps call it a cultural practice that I would like to discuss. So it's not necessarily just about my work or our work, but it's perhaps a more general thing. What you see here is a painting by Gerhard Richter, the famous contemporary German painter. And the painting is called Annunciation after Titian, after Tiziano Vercelli, so the Renaissance painter from Italy. It is a copy, so to speak. It's actually an oil painting by Richter, done in 1973. It's the first painting out of a series of 5, where then the copy, or the original, is more and more blurred and getting more abstract. So what I'm proposing here with that image is to think about what you mentioned already, copying. Copying as a social and cultural practice, imitation, interpretation, of course, and so on. Abstraction that comes with it, perhaps misunderstanding, why not? So what Richter is proposing with that image is not only a look at a particular moment in, let's say, Western Europe culture of the Annunciation. It's not the motif, it's more the technique that is not a practical one, but an intellectual one. It is this technique of appropriation. And it raises the question of authorship. And I think this is very interesting when it comes to history and referring to history and sort of projecting into the future what we actually just took over. Who actually is the author? And that's something that I consider rather interesting. The next one, please. It's just, let's say, more architectural example to somehow give emphasis to the same topic. This is Giovanni Battista Piranesi, so the famous architect, I should say, and perhaps painter or draftsman who represents here in architectural drawings the mausoleum for Cecilia Metella. It's a representation, but it's more than that. It is through that a reconstruction. And when you look more carefully and you see the drawings, the 3D drawings of this masonry, how the bricks are laid, you understand that there is the question, how is this made? How would I do it today? So archaeology ultimately turns into project. He brings it into his present. And I think this is very speaking, because in that sense, it's another programmatic representation of what I think is what we are dealing with. So it's two examples of, let's say, creative practices, a practice of creating form, actually, that is directly emulated or provoked through the cultural heritage of architecture. And this is exactly what I'm proposing somehow also in the context, it's not a very original position, I have to say, but still, what we also propose, or what we try to do in our office in general, and with that mentioned tower perhaps here in particular. And what we want to do is, or what I propose is a method, is a position of making architecture through reinterpretation, appropriation, transformation, and so on. You got that. And to close, I think if we take that as a sort of a conceptual guideline, it might ultimately lead us to an architecture that is more about the common and less about authorship and the stardom. We could also say it is more open access and through that democratic than the hermetic, egocentric proposal of the author. And in that sense, it is not only a design practice, but a social and cultural practice. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we want this to be really a conversation. So first of all, I'd like just to start saying that I'm very reassured as an historian, because when I read Practices Made History, I was really wondering whether I would be out of my job. But it seems you don't want to become historian. That's reassuring. That said, I'd like to start from a paradox, which is that when architecture mentions history, it's usually not about the past, it's about the future. And then, the title, there is one word that is very significant for me in the title of the Biennial, which is new. So I would like to start by what is new for you? And I was just to give a couple of elements from what I heard. I'm really struck by the kind of tension, because on the one hand, let's be practical, history is a series of resources, it's not a big cultural narrative necessarily, and at the same time, the desire to arraign the cultural, to go back to the cultural. The idea also that, we've got to be efficient, etc., but we've got also to be democratic, to be social, so a return of a political agenda. So where do we stand? What is new, and how do you see the future in some way through that lens of history? So whoever wants to jump in, this should really be a conversation. Tatiana?
Yeah, well, I actually kind of little disagree with you. I do think that architecture thinks on the future till now, but builds for the past. I don't see built buildings that are really looking toward the future, or maybe even thinking on the future. I think architecture has to freeze time at a moment and then be built, and it takes so long that time catches back. That in a way, I think we have failed to allow that moment to really build in the future, to really build for the future. And I think that in this moment of architecture, and I see many practices, really trying to think how can you add that factor of the future being able to interact with the architecture you're proposing, And I'm not only talking about the open idea of architecture that is being transformed over time, but also of the possibilities of understanding, for example, the program in a different way, We're still building all of our practices, houses that have 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 1 kitchen, 1 living room, 1 dining room, for families that are the perfect couple with 3 kids and so on. And this is not longer today happening. This is not the majority of the population. Already now we're dated. The families, only 20% of the families are built in like a couple of a man and a woman and 2 children, or 3 or 1 or whatever.
So let's use history to kill the past.
So why are we still in this discourse? So and there are many reasons, but I think that for me, as I said in the beginning, I think when we build, we're already building for the past, and I start to have an optimism that we start with a generation, especially the ones coming behind us, on thinking in building for the future.
Okay. Who else wants to? Emmanuel?
I felt tempted to say I think there's never something new in architecture, actually. So, and for our generation, I felt so relieved that finally this obsession with newness was gone. And then Mark and Sharon put it back on the title. I mean, it's, I don't know.
Oh, you have to defend yourself, Sharon,
I mean,
afterwards.
what is this new thing?
No, I think somehow the sort of paradox of new in history was part of that, was the provocation that we hope to debate. Because I think Mark and I would challenge the idea of the sort of aspiration for the new. And I think perhaps it's about, you know, incremental transformation or appropriation. I think everybody talked about very precise, but maybe not overwhelming ideas of transforming space or kind of ideas about architecture. It was somehow perhaps incremental transformation. And I think that's something that we see in a lot of the participants' work in the exhibition, that there's I think a deep sort of understanding of context, of sort of relating to things, and maybe perhaps that is something new relative to some of the generations just before us.
So if I try to summarize, the newness of the new is actually that it's a new that is more gradual than the modernist new, for example. Okay, that's a way to put it.
I think, you know, one of the things that would be helpful maybe, because this is probably quite clear in the catalog that is being put together, but maybe this morning it wasn't said very explicitly. I think a couple of people might have referred to it, that in a sense this exhibition, this biennial, is the third reincarnation of something like the Chicago Tribune Tower. And that there is the 1922-23 exhibition for a real building, which was very important. That we lived in the world of competitions, and competitions that got built, not just competitions as ideas competitions. So I think in terms of the relation of competition to architectural production, that's an interesting thing. And then you have the 1980 exhibition that was organized by Stanley Tigerman and others. And I think, honestly, Stanley and others around him at that time should be, in many ways, congratulated for, you know, setting up something that established a kind of polemic around the manner in which architecture is produced. At the same time, it was very clear, and they were themselves very critical of knowing that they really didn't have the capacity to organize an exhibition for a real building. Therefore, it was a set of propositions for a kind of hypothetical project. In that sense, it's more fits, I suppose, also with their interests, which are more to do with metaphor and allegory, and within the context of postmodernism, in some ways also made a lot of sense that the connection to history was very direct, in many instances very literal, even though there were many projects that were not necessarily historical, but nevertheless it seemed that there was a kind of ideology of the history as a visual reference. And I think today it's very important that the way the word history is being defined is not quite the same way as the 1980 version of referring to history as a certain set of visual practices, which in some ways would be, I mean, if you were unkind, which I don't want to be unkind, but I mean, there's a difference between mimicking and mimesis in a way. And I think a lot of those projects are about a kind of being very directly referential. So the question today is that hearing from the panelists, the way they're defining history, in the case of Frank, as a sort of instrumental practice, Tatiana as a reference to time and place, you know, Francis to people, and I think, you know, in the case of Emmanuel, in terms of the use appropriation. So now, I think in terms of practice, it would be, I think, important to sort of talk about the methods, in a way, of practice. And I think each of you is suggesting, in some way, some kind of way to enter that kind of conversation. I think it would be helpful to hear also from the audience whether they have, in a way, alternative recommendations in terms of how one really enters this project of engagement, because it's clear that this generation, there is still the continuity of the discussion of typology and type. That's one line. There is the discussion or the importance of the concept of precedent, which actually hasn't been discussed so fully, because in architecture we have really failed to create a discourse around the concept of precedence, a phenomenon that exists very strongly in the legal studies, but I think in architecture we haven't really discussed it, or Antoine hopefully will disagree. And the third thing, which I think relates maybe to what Emmanuel was saying, is maybe you call it appropriation. I was a few weeks ago listening to this English novelist, Hilary Mantel, which I don't know if you know this woman who wrote the book called Wolf Hall. Maybe some people have read this. But this author actually talks about the concept of adaptation, because she, as a novelist, in a way, does adaptations of other people's, of history. So her relationship to history is one which is mediated through fiction. So she's not trying to retell history as a form of authenticity, but as a form of fiction, in a way. So I'm wondering whether now our job is not more, in some ways, closer to the novelist who's imagining things and is, engaging with the project of adaptation, because that's what you're saying, there is no newness, but that the adaptation itself is a form of new practice, in a way, which is deeply engaged in history, but nevertheless is very different from it because it's a form of fiction. So I think it's very important to deal with this concept of the method, the way in which what enters this kind of project. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this, or if there are any comments or questions from the floor. Antoine,
If I was provocative, because when I listened to Frank, for example, I was reminded of the attitude of the 19th century vis-à-vis history. And to say history is a resource, and you use it. And by the way, I find it also very interesting that the 19th century had a total fascination for materials, and we are completely fascinated again by materials. That actually, I don't know whether, perhaps the new is about reinventing what once was, but whether we're not actually, a different kind of narrative in which history is no longer, this long span, great integrative thing about the future, but something much more meticulous, and we go back to the method thing, which is really how do we do it concretely?
No, I think so. I think it is if it's not the visual aspect of history being important, having currency, then you can go back and look at, say, technology or techniques or methods or materials and ask what are contemporary or even future technologies that will trigger a kind of response, or what will, again, the word transformation, what would be, say, a contemporary reading of Jean Prouvé today with the tools and methods that we have today. So for us, that's incredibly interesting. So if there is no avant-garde where we can start from zero, there is this kind of idea of observation and going out and collecting these ways of doing things, at the same time registering back to these histories and understanding what those struggles were at the time historically and what we can do now. So it is kind of evolution, but I think the paradigm shift for me would be going from a visual problem to a kind of physical one. So we don't simply run to the encyclopedia every time we want to do a project, but there is an idea of being informed by those procedures before, and how we can, in a sense, revisit that in a very new way.
So, we all learn from history. I believed always in this, there is a picture of the world standing on the shoulder of giant, which in the 12th century by Charter means to celebrate previous scientists, and historian, I think the new is if we really learn from the past and we adapt it properly to the future, but we're not doing so. I mean, our society is getting closer. I was this morning in London, now I'm sitting here. I mean, our world is getting closer, but we keep building the same housing with 3 bathrooms, and we knock the door, and we don't think about our society being open. I mean, it's not we, but we need partner. We need people that have a vision to accept things happening, things that are enclosing and not excluding. And so to talk a little bit about our tower, the proposal of my office, is to just playfully try to integrate space, public space, inside a tower, which, I mean, it's economically one of the really high-dense structure in architecture. But we try to say, if we architect don't come with that kind of vision where we want people to gather together rather than to lock themselves in the door, how could we communicate? So in this really getting closer world, I'm sorry.
I was wondering, you know, listening to you, and because I was struck by what was said about images. Let's suppose that we want to go beyond an history that is images, but then we have a problem. How do we organize? And this is where I'm also very much struck by the surge in the notion of type. You know, there is the big return, it's almost back to Durand in some ways, the big return of the notion of type as a possible non-graphic articulation of material use, etc. So I wanted a little bit to pick the brain of the panel on, and you know, you mentioned, after all, everybody here has done a tower as an exercise on type and variation. And type is always, you know, to go to Tatiana thing, there is no type without breaking with a type. It's also part of the typology. I wanted to hear you about that, that question of the type and the necessity in a way to break with the type.
Well, for me, the notion of time is really special, and it's very important because, as I said like before, when you are placed in exactly that moment, at that a specific point, and then you're thinking on the future and you're going to build in the future, then you're already dated. Because it was frozen in a moment which it does no longer exist anywhere. So I think architecture needs to play with this thing. And in a way, I liked the description of Mohsen saying about this narrative, fictional narrative that we should create. I would also add the fantasy factor on it. So I would like to say that maybe then it's when we could gain over time and pass by, no? And imagining a fantastical narrative that it's fictional, then we maybe takes us further in breaking that line.
Oh, sorry, I just, I don't think that we should be novelists necessarily. I mean, of course, we have to have a narrative, but I have 2 things. I mean, first, I think the way we are discussing history, or also how we sort of use it or adapt it, is fundamentally ahistorical. I mean, for me, there is no difference, and I'm suggesting that's for everyone, whether this precedent being then maybe understood or caught as its essence in the form of a type or a principle, you could call it the concept or the idea, that this in the end doesn't matter anymore whether this is 50 years old or 500 or just 5 weeks. And this is also so fantastic and also a bit weird in our profession that we still, and now that's my second point, ahistoric, second, pragmatic. Tradition, culture has to do with laziness. It's about solutions. And it's interesting, Argan, for instance, when they reintroduced the type in the 60s in Italy, and immediately there is that struggle, that the type is, among many other definitions, you could say this is like solutions from the past. I'm here, and that's important, extremely contemporary, couldn't be different. I have first to understand the problem, nothing to do with history, nothing to do with nostalgia or whatever, now projecting to the future, yes, trying to anticipate. I have to take a position, what do I do? Bring the people together, and now I'm simplifying the solution. And then comes history as the toolbox. What can I use, you know? I mean, it was that way somehow. And then And this is true. We are not, it's not academic in the sense that we find it fancy, Stanley Tigerman and a bit of Hollein and then next time another image, you know. It's not the collage of aesthetics. It's somehow searching for solutions. But obviously, and then it's getting interesting, the solution from the past is inspiring. It's there, but it's not enough. And then I challenge and I negotiate and there is the conflict. And then, okay, I have to correct myself. Then it's new, perhaps.
I would almost agree, because it's true that, you know, when you have a new incoming PhD in architectural history who happens to be an architect, you have a severe deprogramming of what he's done before very often. That said, I'm always, you know, if we go back to the title of this panel, to make history, you know, you're never completely pragmatic, because you're at the same time building in a moment in history, and you want to make sense of that moment, which means that even if you use in a completely high historical, I agree, all kinds of reference from the past, etc., you're trying to situate yourself within the history. So, in a way, my question would be, how do you see the way you make history in that sense? Position yourself in the present, but in a history to unfold.
And I think that argument makes the use of the word solution a little bit problematic, because I think you have to define what are the kind of parameters of the way in which you use the word solution. You know, because I believe you're using it in a much more inclusive, you know, it's not a technocratic solution. It's a solution that is also looking at like the performative dimension.
Otherwise
of the
become an
museum,
engineer.
You know.
I use it also as a provocation in the sense that I think architecture is somehow related to a purpose and to technical conditions. But of course, just solving the problem is not architecture. Don't misunderstand, please. But I think...
But there's this thing about architecture being a discipline, right? It does have this enormously long history, and that one feels this sort of seduction or desire to go back to history, to sort of rummage around and make it current somehow. I mean, I saw a very strange presentation by Jeff Koons a few months ago where he was comparing each of his pieces of work to an old master, which seemed to be a very strange thing to do, in a way to give your own present and current work a kind of authority. So I think because of the idea of the discipline, that there is this sort of feeling or obligation to go back. But at the same time, I feel that we're quite able to work in the present with confidence. But there is this kind of...
What I meant is, you know, because of course there is always the desire to, you know, situate yourself vis-à-vis Alberti, Vitruvius, whatever. But I think when you work in the present, you work knowing that you're going to be looked at by people yet to come, etc. So you're also making a stance for the future. This is what I wanted to convey at the beginning, that actually when you mobilize history, there is always the question of the future. And for me, this is in some ways, I understood this exhibition about what is the present and what are the bifurcation, you know, what are the turning point of the present and how do we enact them.
Which at the end, anyway, nevertheless, is going to build the future, no? Because it's going to become history. It's going to be reflective of its moment, which is also important, no? It's definitely important that architecture becomes the narrative of history, of past at the end. It's a big part of it, architecture. So we have to be conscious of that as well, no? So we're going to become that, whatever we do, as small or as big, it's going to be there, and it's going to be narrating that moment in the future, no? For history.
For that, you need to have made the turning point or bifurcation or difference.
Or not. It's going to just be part of it, no?
I was just going to say something, maybe picking up a little bit on what Emmanuel was saying, and I don't know if this gets to where it's leading, but maybe it's a little bit about method. I mean, thinking about how I think the projects that everybody presented in relation to this issue of type, that I think, you know, we talk about working with type as a kind of approximation. Perhaps historically, when we look at typological conditions, there's a certain fixity about the courtyard type, the tower type, and I think what perhaps everybody presented in different ways today was more about kind of assembling different approaches to whether it's a material problem in the case of what Frank was doing, or I think Francis thinking about a certain method of working with materials, let's say in the very local projects in Burkina Faso. And so I think that perhaps what creates an opening that perhaps is a little bit indeterminate right now is this idea that there's a sort of lack of total determination about the way these pieces come together. I mean, I think, Francis, you've written about this idea you have, especially as you move out of your native culture, about crossing of materials or practices as a way to advance your work. And I think this perhaps allowing that sort of looseness of a method of working to advance questions around type or form or material practice is something that perhaps allows buildings to have a kind of future that's somehow undetermined, embedded in them, but it's not about futurism or anything. It's just about a flexibility, a potential that is yet defined. And I think that's a kind of interesting quality of architecture that we see today. Sort of a generosity, a sort of potential to be occupied in different ways, maybe than their authors even considered.
Maybe we could have a few questions, and there are mics. I mean, one aspect of what you are now all discussing now relates to the socio-economic political dimension, which what you're calling the situating of the project in a historical context is about a certain set of responsibilities, whether they're political, ethical. And so the discussion of history is also about that situating. So maybe there could be some kind of reflection on that. So please, anybody else, maybe we could get a few questions or comments, and then we can ask the panel to respond. So we have one there, please.
Thanks. So I may be jumping the gun, and this is more appropriate for the next panel. But I find it interesting how often history is invoked here, and I can't help thinking of Tafuri's theories and history, and noticing that the word theory has not been mentioned. And so somehow there are definitely kind of plural histories going on here. But the question that I wonder is, what is the place of theory in the conversation? Has it fallen out of the conversation? Has it been subsumed into this concept of history? I find it a very strange lacuna in the conversation. I wonder, maybe you could comment.
Would you add the word criticism to that? I mean, that's the title of most of the history theory criticism programs. So why not include criticism as well?
Well, because
I think it's a real
because
question,
the audience is
actually.
filled with critics.
Yeah. So that issue, maybe, Antoine, let's just see if there is some other comments. So one is around the discussion of theory. There, the chip back there, there's, yes, and the lady behind.
I'd wonder if the panelists could talk a little bit about, when you talk about history, and Mohsen, you referenced the 1980 exhibit and catalog that Stanley put together, which I think that you rightly said referenced visual forms and used those as a reference to history. But even at that sort of, what you could say, to our generation might look like sort of very visual and superficial use, those forms come embedded with a series of a priori emotional and historical connections. And a lot of the discussion today hasn't really talked about the relationship of nostalgia, meaning, and contextualism within the history that then, Emmanuel, you talk about your historical toolbox. Well, when you go to that toolbox, you know, you're an educated guy, you know that those forms and those techniques and those relationships that you're using from history have that kind of content. And what could that mean to the type of work, for example, that Tatiana is doing with the collage, right, where you're layering those meanings on top of each other?
And the lady behind you, yes. Anyone else?
My question is related to the teaching of history, which is a little bit of what I do. And the people that I teach are 18-year-old freshmen from Wisconsin. And they sort of walk in wide-eyed. And the first question I ask them is, what is architecture, by the way? Maybe we should start there. And I emphasize it not as a binary versus building, but how does architecture and the history of architecture function within the larger umbrella of building. And one of the things that I say is, well, maybe that those buildings that become architecture are the ones that people started talking about a lot and writing about a lot, and they ended up in the history books. So what should we even care about 99% of those buildings that are not architecture that do not survive the history books?
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I wanted to add the word criticism that
Okay.
after the word theory was introduced, because when we hear that with such an enthusiasm, the advocating for this operative use of history, history it could be or has been extremely violent too. I mean, history is a tool to actually wipe out other things that actually happened in the past. And so through the lens of criticism, looking at the past, one sort of like bring to the fore things that have left behind for longer periods of time. So and that's kind of like the role of the historian, but I wonder if with the tools of the architect, one can look at the past with that lens and not sort of like look at history of what happened, but as the sort of like mechanism through which other things had wiped out basically from the past.
Any, I mean, Antoine, why don't you? Yes.
Okay, I'll start by a provocative thing, which is meant for Michael, of course. I think right now, theory is almost dying, and we need to resurrect it in a way or another, because, as we all know, history and theory have to go together. But it's true that right now we're in a situation in which, in some ways, it has become extremely difficult to promote what we used to call theory in School of Architecture. So that's starting from a fact. For me, and which is also a question. A second thing to answer, I think, was Yasmin who asked the question. I think it's always a very mixed, complex agenda when you teach history in a School of Architecture. I think you teach precedent, for sure. Actually, you provide tools, and you know that in some ways you provide tools. I think you do something else, which is also extremely important, which is to try to explain how buildings are the result of complex situation and etc. So there is also that to be gained from history, and this is equally important, even if the kids tend sometimes to prefer something else. And we do a third thing, which is why the historians and designers have these complex relations. We co-construct the discipline with the practitioner. We tend the cemetery of the discipline, but this is a very powerful also tool. So we do these three things, and this is always a complex agenda. And it's true that we're facing challenges. For example, it's true that, for example, Africa is lacking very often from a lot of these official histories. It goes to the, I don't know whether it's critique or it's not actually enlarging dramatically the scope of what we teach. I think this is a huge question today. So just.
But I mean, Emmanuel is going to, but I do want to maybe suggest that actually theory is not dead.
No, I'm not saying it's dying. I would say it's dying.
It's dying.
But we have
well, I just actually see.
Heal it.
No, but I see in the
yet dead.
No, I see both. I mean, I see in the work of these architects and even the panel, the way that they're discussing, that there is in fact a theoretical position that they're presenting. So before we might have had the theoreticians and the practitioners, and the theoreticians set the agenda often for the practitioners to follow. That game is over in some ways, but I think we have so many, interesting architects who are actually dealing with the theorization of even the nature of this symposium or this exhibition. I think that the way that history is being opened up is through a theoretical framework. It's not just through a historical framework. It's actually being theorized in some way. I would say that in terms of criticism, it really is a pity that there isn't more involvement with architectural criticism. Partly, it seems that is to do with the death of journals and to do with the possibility of serious writing, which really is focusing much more systematically on the discussion of architecture and buildings. And that now, with all these way in which online criticism works and whatever, there is really, the profession has become so dispersed that everybody is a critic. And it's really no longer criticism, it's just opinion in some way. So the art of criticism is something that really needs to be resuscitated, because while the architects might be able to theorize the relationship to history, the beneficial relationships that would come from criticism of the work is no longer possible through journals, through these kinds of things. And I think it would be good to find ways to kind of reconstruct that whole relationship.
We have a lot of things to resurrect. It seems Francis wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted to say the influence of the new media has brought us to a level that is no voice that is dominating. You have access to many, many voices. And in the past, you have some theoreticians that could just work on their ideas for a long time. For the moment, it's very difficult because everyone has access easily, and in where you have internet. So.
Yeah, and I still think, that the solution is not entirely, theory being a general, because I think it takes time to work on concept. And it's true that right now, what I was stating, I think we're really in a state of crisis, but we need to find a solution. It takes time to work on concept. It's a hard work usually, not very rewarded in the Facebook age. You don't post a concept, in the morning for your state of mind. I think there is a real problem, which echoes completely what you said.
But I think it maybe is that it's making theory through practice, no? Instead of making history through practice. I think, at least in our case, it's making theory through practice. So it's testing it, it's going back, but it's definitely having a theory. I don't think it has disappeared.
That I agree.
It has changed the way we.
No, completely agree.
If I may add something, I would love to be a little bit positive. Again, thinking about learning from the past, we know that every time when you feel there is a crisis, this is the momentum where really we are creative. And I see it is, it's a huge field for us to practice, to write, to work. If I may just put to your attention, in less than 50 years, the labor power in Africa will be double those in entire Asia. I mean, come on, there is a lot to go there and do things and write. It's just, so
it's great.
I think positive, yeah.
Very good. Manuel, did you have something?
Actually you gave my answer. I really think what we're doing here is pure theory. It's maybe not a written, systematic theory, but it's nothing directly to do what I understand under academic history. I mean, this is a different discipline, and I really beg not to be misunderstood as a light-hearted sort of half-serious guy who is abusing of history. That's not what we're trying to say here. We are struggling to find ways of dealing with history, but that's not a sort of a scientific approach. And of course, we know about the specificities. And what I like in that sense is that the historian is looking at the object or at a time, and is sort of course, anchored in the context. You can't move it. You have to understand it. You are analytical. Whereas then, in simple words, theory is addressing the ideas, the concepts, and they travel. They can travel through time and space. And in that sense, it's a bit simple put that way, but I think that is a fundamental difference. And theory it's unimaginable not to have theory.
I agree. I agree.
But I think but maybe it's the other way around. This idea that theory somehow drives a kind of architectural project, and I think whether it's theory or journalism, I think it's how do you dissimulate and project ideas, especially in an age where work is so plural. I mean, everybody is working in a really different way. In different cultural circumstances, in different opportunities technologically, et cetera, So for me, say the currency of journalism, how are ideas projected? Which ideas are important, which are not? And so that's, to me, would be a much more urgent problem than me thinking about theory, is how that's going to get me out of bed in the morning.
So are there a few more thoughts? Does anybody disagree with anything that the panel have said? Would anybody like to speak about the disagreement? Luis, do you have, are you in agreement completely? Any thoughts? Please, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. If theory is being debated right now as something that is relevant or not, in light of the comment about the death of journalism, I see.
Can you speak up a little bit? It's hard
yes,
to hear
yes,
you.
sorry. In comment to your so in relation to your comment about the death of journalism, I see it as a kind of question of reception of the architecture, how the public and the culture consumes the architecture, and if the public were up on the theory through journalism, you know, if there was a culture of criticism in the general public, a more elevated, I guess, public discussion of what a building perhaps means to the general public, would that change your attitudes towards whether theory is relevant to your practice or not?
I'm not, do you understand what, so
I guess
I'll try,
maybe,
shall I try to?
I guess I'm just wondering, like, you know, who benefits from saying if theory is dead or if it's not,
Yeah, but there are two sides of this conversation, right? One is about the question of how architects are situating themselves in the world and what are the procedures, methods that they're using in order to produce a body of work that is situated, grounded, you know, socially responsible, but at the same time, obviously, makes a contribution in terms of the architecture as a kind of imaginative discourse. There is another side of this which is to do with its reception. In whose name are these architects speaking? For whom are they doing this thing?
Right.
And that audience, the citizen, the public, what is the nature of the public's reception of that work? Now, today, in my line of work, for example, everybody is an expert about architecture. It's a completely subjective enterprise because people assume that they know because it's to do with like and dislike. I like it, I don't like it, this one is better because I like it. In other disciplines, this does not happen, partly because there is the question of the trust in the profession, and partly because there is the danger, like if you're a doctor, that if you don't listen to the person, you can't operate on yourself. And partly, it is a question of cultural conditions. We live in a society where there is zero support for cultural practices in high schools, whatever. So it doesn't matter, you know. I mean, like there is the knowledge of the culture of reception is to some degree undermined. So that I think, I mean, this is not the full answer, but I do think that there is, in a way, a side of this discussion, which is to do with issues of perception, which has to be deeply rooted in certain cultural practices, and those we don't have in many places. So unless we kind of invest in those things, but when the money for the arts gets cut, and when there's no high school that has any art classes or architecture history classes and whatever, what is, you know, who's to understand the importance of these contributions? They become purely kind of subjective, you know. So
sorry, just to jump in, and there comes another important role of theory, because ideally, if theory is not getting too complicated, it can act as a sort of a subtext or the narrative against you measure, and then we have a criticism. There is no criticism without a system you relate to, and this is the theoretical discourse. So the more a theoretical discourse or parts of it can be shared with a bigger community, the more there is a sort of a measurement. I mean, this is maybe a bit theoretical, but as a thought, but I think this is an important role of theory. It acts as the benchmark for criticism, isn't it?
Yeah, I think to go back to what Mohsen say, I think the biggest problem is that architecture is a narrow island of education in a sea of ignorance. You know, I think, frankly, the problem of taste versus there is something to really learn and know in architecture is a universal problem these days. I would add also that, you know, we're talking about theory as if it was a unified body. Don't forget that, for example, you know, there are critical Marxist theories coming back in domains like geography, etc. And you know, what we call theory is actually not a unified field. and with extremely different method and concept, etc. And I see more actually the resurrection of theory like the reinvention of a battlefield than a unified doctrine that will enable us to wonderfully connect with society at large. I think we're going to have to answer a number of questions, for example, for the social. I think what is very striking is how the social and the political, 15 years ago, you know, it was almost vulgar to talk about that. They are back in pretty much every project in this Biennial. But the social and the political, what is the right theory?
Sharon, do you have any last words? Anybody, I don't know, Tatiana, does anybody want to say anything? We've come to the end of our time, but I want to make sure if you'd like to make any comments, concluding, final words. No? Sharon?
Yeah, I was just going to thank you guys for putting this together. I think, you know, we've actually had, we've been traveling around the world presenting the biennial and some of the ideas with participants, and I think there's been a tremendous interest in people wanting to come and perhaps bring architects and perhaps theorists together to engage in conversations through this biennial. And I hope that, you know, starting today, through some publications that may be in the works, that we can continue. I mean, this seems like a really good starting point to perhaps build some of the bridges that we're talking about between this kind of this connection. So I appreciate everybody's, you got the intelligence of the questions that you guys put together. I think it's been a really interesting discussion.
Well, thank you all. I do want to maybe finish with 2 lines of a quote. I mentioned Hilary Mantel, and maybe this is sort of useful in the context of this way in which everyone has talked about the kind of the broad set of conditions, but at the same time having having positions, taking certain kind of responsibility, the call to action. Somewhere she said, this is about the novel, that Emmanuel says we shouldn't be doing the novel, but I think you can use the word architecture. You could say architecture involves using powers of the informed imagination, to examine the nature of evidence. Now, the examination of the nature of evidence, I think, could touch on precedent, on type, on history, the circumstances, all the things that are going to really be the basis for Emmanuel's solution in some way, but using the powers of the informed imagination to get at that. So thank you all very much. Thank you.